Okay, thank everyone. Attention. So, thank you all for coming. It's Thursday. It's a week or two before the final review, so I really appreciate that you're here. There's some new faces. I don't know who you guys are, but thanks for coming. Which one? ACC. Oh, brilliant. Cool. Super cool. You guys are hardly ever here. We never see. So thank you.
Thanks for trekking down the hill.
Yeah, so far. And we've got TUM students, Geomatics students hiding here. We've got my students, and we've got some of you are that in your face. Urban design. Wow, this is a rare sighting of the best spotted urban designers from the 60s. So no, thank you. Yeah, thank you for coming. And we've also got staff, tech staff, alumni. So thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate that. I'm very happy to introduce Lindsay Blair Howe, who I've known for far too long. It's scary when you start counting all the years that you know. Oh yeah, that thing happened. That was 10, 15. Oh my God. And she is many things: an urban researcher, a writer, an editor. But most importantly for here, she's been through the cult that is architecture and come out unscathed, or mostly unscathed. But Lindsay and I met when she was doing a PhD in Johannesburg, in that wonderful city that governs most of our country and parallel to Cape Town. And her work over the years and through that process focuses on ideas of peripheralisation, urban transformation, and spatial inequality. And obviously focusing on South Africa today, but Lindsay's work is much more expansive than that, I have to say. And she has founded the Centre for Urbanisation and Peripheralisation, CUSP, which we are part of, affiliated, connected to, and you were now part of that process, where this research examines how contemporary urbanisation reshapes lived experiences, territories, and forms of belonging. So the students that are here are also part of that whole experience as well. And her interdisciplinary practice speaks across not just sort of architectural sort of engagements, but across research, critical writing, public discourse, with a very strong focus on how cities are represented, narrated, and contested, both through policy and everyday life. So while it sounds very urban, high scale, you're going to see a lot of really lovely detail and a lot of interface between policy and experience and these things that make this work really exciting to share at this point in the year. So Lindsay, thank you so much for giving us your time, and I look forward to seeing what you can share.
Thanks. Thanks so much for that introduction. It's always wonderful to have a little bit of a reflection with you as well on this kind of body of time that we've known each other and how far we've come from, just kind of finishing masters and thinking about, architecture projects on a really small scale. And for me, as John has said, my journey has really been from doing very small architectural projects. I have an undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture, but then coming up through and trying to understand the context of how building is actually done and made led me into this kind of urbanism direction. So I kept going further and further and further out and looking at bigger and bigger scales of things until I started encountering theories like planetary urbanization, where you're just talking about the interrelations of the entire world and how peripheralisation happens on different scales. So that's mostly what I'm here to talk to you about today. When I use the word urbanization, I mean that is an active process of transforming one thing into another. The nature of the constructed environment we see around us, and as John has said, I do mostly work in Johannesburg, so here in South Africa, but not quite here where we are today. So I thought I would at least treat you to one picture of your place for the start of the day, that I had this lovely view coming in after this massive rainstorm coming from Johannesburg to Cape Town yesterday. And just thinking about, this is my brain goes crazy when I see these things. I just want to map it and understand it and get everything together. I don't know, it sounds okay. Just video. Because you can see from the air, and this is why I always show some kind of view like this at the beginning of my lectures, because you can really see how all of these different pieces are stitched together in various ways. And if we want to understand this as an urban whole, it's really, really complex, and it requires a lot of work coming at multiple scales. So that's pretty much what I try to do, is to understand the broader urban fabric, looking at things on the macro scale, on policy level, on the history level, but then also really zooming into different places to do ethnographic research and talk to people, because we can't understand why this is the way it is if we don't have both this sort of contemporary perspective, what everyday life is like for people, how they're transforming the built environment, sometimes with very innovative strategies in the face of great precarity, and then how the kind of all comes together in a relational whole. So for me, it's really important in my work that we never do just one thing on one scale, but we always have to look at the broader picture to understand how the urban is working. So as Jana said, I've recently gotten a professorship in Munich for urban and spatial development, and I'm really happy to have two of our team members here today, one who's a UCT grad, and Lindsay Sawyer, who's part of our teaching team and research team. And what we really have in common across Center for Urbanization and Peripheralisation with Jono as well, who's also associated with us. We're very happy about that too, along with many other colleagues in Munich and around the world. But we all have kind of a shared critical take on urban theory. We use a lot of qualitative and artistic research methods, particular ethnographic methods that come from sociology and anthropology as a frame for our work. And then we try to see how this applies to spatial development and the design sciences. So we teach studio. That's why we have our Munich students here. Very happy to have you guys here in Cape Town as well. So thanks for making the journey down from warmer weather to rainy weather. It's so appreciated to have you in the room. But yeah, what we really try to do is look at all these ways that peripheralization manifests through spatial practices. So spatial practices, again, is the interstice kind of everyday life and larger macro scale designs and politics. So we work with theories of extended urbanization, just to give you a little bit of a framing where we fall into these things. We also, with our colleagues, the Gauteng City Region Observatory, for example, Sam Kanile, we're looking at sustainability and just transitions, and all of the work that we do really does try to look across the global north and the global south so that that binary begins to dissolve, because for all of us, really, our knowledge has been shaped by Africa, South Africa specifically for many of us, or Nigeria in Lindsay's case. But we read everything through the lenses of these urban places, through the placemaking, through the cities themselves. And something that's also really important to us, I was told by a colleague last summer already that she knew someone who was working on the new IPCC report coming out, that we've now passed this 1.5 degree benchmark. So the new buzz phrase for planning in the future is post-2 planning, post-2 degrees over pre-industrialization temperature levels planning. So when we think about our cities and we see infrastructure starting to fail in places like Johannesburg, sometimes infrastructure is also failing in Germany when the Deutsche Bahn is not running on time, but we do need to be able to mitigate this damage that we've done in a way that also gives people a chance to flourish and to have their livelihoods. And one of the places where I see this really coming most sharply into view is in Johannesburg. And I had a presentation just a couple of days ago. I've published a book now that was a lot of this work from my dissertation, doing the things I was just telling you about, looking at bigger and smaller scales and how they intersect. And many of the ideas that have been percolating for decades are captured in this book. And it began really with a simple question, which is, what is it about Johannesburg that always drew me back to it as a place? Why is it something that always feels so dynamic? And I think in a way, it's because that city always exceeds the categories that we bring to it. It's not just a mining city or a post-apartheid city or even an African metropolis, although it is also all of those things too. But it's really ordinary in a way because it's just people living their lives. And it's also extraordinary because they do so with such persistence and resilience in the face of the legacy of apartheid, very difficult conditions, through mobility, through transit, and trying to negotiate and claim space. So Johannesburg feels to me like a place, and I would include Cape Town in this as well as another great example, as urban regions where the stakes of urban theory really come sharply into view. Because we can't pretend that urbanization is something that unfolds neutrally. There's always politics, and there's bodies, and there's emotions behind it. And it makes visible the violence of extraction and of land grabs and the cost of infrastructure and mobility. So without wanting to write about it as a pathologizing way, the book that I wrote is kind of almost a love letter to the city as well, because there's incredible densities of joy and resilience and innovation that are in there too. So the book, that's this one here, you can have it open access online with UCL Press, so please feel free to download and enjoy if you're interested in this. But I'm just saying this a little bit briefly about the book before I go more into the topic of peripheralization that I came to talk to you about here today. But I would really recommend it if you're interested in this kind of intersection between spatial scales, because that's really what characterizes the book and also my broader work and the work that we do in TU Munich collectively as a research group. And the book represents also this very key theoretical proposition, which is to take Johannesburg or Cape Town or any African city as a site of knowledge production. So not as a case that illustrates theory from elsewhere, but as a place that generates concepts, methods, and can set intellectual agendas. And mine really is done by following the people. It's what I call following the people. So the idea about peripheralisation and urbanisms that are both ordinary and extraordinary emerged out of it. And so this book basically tells the stories of people that I spent years engaging with and observing, working with a smartphone methodology where I collected volunteer geographic information with an app and tracked people's daily lives and patterns, supplemented with all kinds of interviews of qualitative research, doing ride-alongs with them as they went about their daily lives and trying to understand how something like the city of Johannesburg that we see on the cover of the book, it's a picture from the top of the Ponte Tower, how that is related to everything else that we see around us as this kind of like magnetic epicenter of the entire city region that's, you know, almost 200 kilometers in distance. We're talking about really big spatial scales. And again, it's difficult when you're just looking from a larger scale to try to say, okay, I think I understand what's actually going on in this kind of urban environment. But one thing that became really useful for me as an architect who was trying to become more of a theorist over time were the theories of Henri Lefebvre. And the book is also about that. If you're interested in a very pragmatic take on this 1960s and 70s French philosopher who talks about the production of space, I can also recommend the introduction to the book. Because it basically breaks it down into 3 dimensions. And this is what I always tell my design students as well. If we want to understand how space is shaped, we can never just look at a building or just at a person. We have to look at the systems around it and how they interact. So Lefebvre proposed that there's 3 dimensions to understanding space. Space is always a social space, and it's produced through spatial practices. So that's like the material environment we see around us. It's your roads, your streets, it's the people moving through them. You can look at the conceived space or the spaces of regulations, which is what we all do as planners and designers. We decide the rules about how this space is going to be shaped. And we looked at people's lived experiences. And that's not just looking at a mobility routine, which is something I also do, but really trying to understand collective imaginations, memories, histories, personalities, what it feels like as a body to be in the space. And that's something we're not necessarily very well trained in architecture necessarily. So that's something that I hope also makes a bit of a contribution. So what I do with my work really was not just mapping where people went, but trying to understand how all of these things come together to produce a really specific space and how those really specific spaces comprise an entire region. And these impulses about this on a theoretical level, which I won't go into in too much detail, but it's talking about that we need a new vocabulary of words to describe the urban and the different scales under which it unfolds. So this was going on more than 10 years ago already by Neil Brenner and Christian Schmid, who was my thesis supervisor at the ETH Zurich. And they were really criticizing this idea, which I still find important enough to mention to you today, that the city is not the center of everything, and it should not be our object of study. We have to go much further out of cities if we really want to understand why life is unfolding the way it is. Because at the time, kind of, you know, in the early 2000s, everyone was talking about how, oh, more than 50% of the population now lives in cities. But what does that actually mean? I mean, what meaningful difference does it have for us besides municipal boundaries, tax bases, those kinds of pragmatic and political things? What does it mean for people to live in cities? So the proposition that came out of this was really that we have to look far beyond metropolitan centers. We have to look at the way that urbanization unfolds until it comes to a natural end. What are commuting patterns? What are the peripheries? And that completely changed the vocabulary with which I understood the construction of space. And so this is the kind of the key arguments that I also outlined in my book and why Lefebvre became useful to me, because his ideas about center and periphery, how they new concentrations of people in space also leave other places behind. And that's a dynamic process that's continually evolving. It really looks, as my book does this in Johannesburg, it looks at how that kind of space has changed over time and what that means for us now. Where are the centralities? Where are the places that are left as a periphery? And how can you actually define those kind of things? Because periphery as a term in urban studies is not actually captured very specifically. So that's something that I wanted to talk about today, is basically point number 2 for the rest of the time, how peripheralisation is something that is produced, it's enacted. I don't think of a periphery as a geographical condition or just a social condition. It's something that has to do with space and with everyday life, macro scale economic processes, opportunities, spatial practices, and also the experience of space and life. These are things that then we call urbanization processes. So all of this It's also an institutional and a pedagogical kind of proposition, asking what it means for all of us too, people in the room here, to train ourselves, to train our students, and to train our own practices, to be able to think from the ground up, and not just from the policy level or observation, but by engaging with people and understanding everyday life to come up with these new architectural imaginaries that we're expected to perform. So if we think about the definition of what a periphery is, some literatures, for example, scholars like Teresa Caldera will talk about peripheral urbanization as a sort of socio-spatial phenomenon that can occur anywhere people are making things that are kind of what she calls transversal. So something that maybe the state doesn't expect you to do or planning doesn't expect you to do, like backyarding is a good example of that in this context. So that for her is a periphery. Okay, maybe. Henri Lefebvre would say something a little bit different, would say that there's spatial dialectics, this push and pull, like I was describing before, of centrality and periphery, and that makes space extend into vast distances. And because capitalism is always needing more and more territory to consume, our populations are growing, we need food, we need resources, space expands. So it has a footprint, these kind of processes. So that's one way to think about it. And in South Africa, of course, people's options get really constrained by those kind of geographies. We've got this entrenched history of apartheid. I'll show a little bit later on in the talk. Also, current research I'm doing in the former Bantustans around the Gauteng City region. But here, the history has often been the relegation of poor and historically underprivileged populations to geographical peripheries. So there's some overlap between forms of geographical and social marginalization, but that can also happen just as much right in the center of a city, that places can be extremely marginalized and extremely underprivileged, even though theoretically they may be closer to the resources and opportunities that urban centers provide. So this process of appropriation and capitalization and expulsion, we can talk about that really on a very theoretical level, but I won't, because we're just going to talk about how people live in Johannesburg now and how those kind of conditions of displacement that came from, sort of manufactured by the apartheid regime, are now being invested in, because there has to be a spectrum of things that happen in order to repair the city, to stitch it back together, to support people's movements. And so mobility is really a very central thing that's done, right? So we all know about transit-oriented design policies. I was just around in the city now before this, looking at the buses that have come into the center of Cape Town. These were also systems with the Rea Vaya and Joburg that were very contested at the time. And when change comes like that, to try to connect people to opportunities, that's one way you can handle it, or you can also try to bring opportunities to people where there are. And I think there's a lot more in between that we're not really used to interrogating. So that's something I'd like to keep picking up on. But when we talk about like the landscapes of these city regions and all of the things that underpin it for people to be able to sustain their lives, to move, to be able to feed their families and do all these kind of normal quotidian activities of everyday life, these ordinary things, we really do have to understand, as I said before, the interrelatedness of the different scales. So what I was doing with my doctoral research, and I've been developing over many, many years, is basically trying to visually map the synthesis of all these different kinds of information. The interviews with people, the different categories of space, they all come from, I mean, it's distilled into kind of 5 very general categories, which I would argue about it, probably not exactly the same if I would do it again today, because this research is from 10 years ago. And cities are always changing, urban areas are constantly evolving and shifting. But the idea is to bring together all of the different qualities that you have from research of everyday life along levels of policy to understand why cities are evolving the way they are on multiple scales. So this mapping method, we talk about the relationality of this urban configuration here, was something that I did also on multiple scales and iterations. So in Johannesburg, it became clear to me, you can read it so easily from the air, like I showed on the introduction slide, spaces of privilege and spaces of poverty, and sort of historical legacy of the way that the city was evolving. So I started mapping those specific urbanization processes and trying to figure out what was going on in spaces that seemed like the processes of urban development were actually continuing to cement people in space that had historically been underprivileged and marginalized. So I spent a lot of time going to informal settlements, going to talk to people who are backyarding and figuring out all the different gradations of relationships there. So things like land become really important. Who's owning the land? How much security do I have if I'm living somewhere? Am I renting a shack from someone, or am I building a shack myself? Because then they require less rent if they've not provided it for you. So all of these kind of manifold relationships led me to really strongly interrogate this idea about informality and about urban informality, as well as about periphery. So what does it actually mean to be peripheralized? And I found, just as Christian Schmid had said in this article with Neil Brenner, more than a decade ago, I didn't have a vocabulary that described what I was actually finding. So a big part of the work then that was going on, for the better part of 5-6 years, was trying to distill the things that I was finding into something that could be reflected like that. So what do those colors mean? We're looking here at Marlborough South. You can see this little strip going down the middle here. So it's above the township of Alex in Johannesburg. And I actually wrote my master's thesis and did a design project here in this space as well with my colleague Vanessa Jos. But this is an example that I ended up calling toehold urbanization, because a periphery can also be right in the middle of all kinds of opportunities. So people are not at the far geographic extensions, kind of the orange dot on the map there. It's very central to the city region, this place. And people have carved out small spaces for themselves because it's close to opportunities. So it's a light industry area where people were doing a couple of different things. So photos by Mark Lewis, the Johannesburg-based photographer. It's also Cape Town sometimes too. Some people were building shacks in the way that we see quite often in sort of South African landscapes. Some also even quite inventive little constructions were coming about. And some people had actually hijacked the warehouses and had occupied these spaces and built shacks, like the cities within the confines of the walls of these former light industry and engineering buildings. The inside of one of them here, where SDI was going and doing an enumeration project at the time. We were conducting this research. And people are really working in very resourceful and clever ways to get by and to shape these spaces and to make them their own. But of course, we have to remember there's a lot of danger associated with this as well, because when people are making their own environments, there's often still gas cooking. There's fires, things are not up to code. So it's not to romanticize this. That's not at all the point, but it's just to say that people are being very inventive in their ways. And I actually think quite strongly that we need to support people in being able to do these kind of things. So as opposed to what I said before of oftentimes policy looks at, do we do transit projects to bring people in? Or do we try to have businesses concentrate where people are? I think there's also alternatives where you try to support people more in the livelihoods they're making, but that requires so much information and so much time. It's a really hard project to do. And that's where research can be useful. That's where we can also go out and be useful to cities, to regions in understanding and planning, because some places will develop wonderful open qualities of life despite the difficulty and the grittiness of it. And that's a key question for me then, is what allows these qualities to evolve and what happens on this entire spectrum of things in between. And we see even, of course, sometimes that the language of what we would have called previously informality has been picked up by the state. So this is also shacks that were built by the city of Joburg and in Marlborough South. Those were not built by people themselves. It was built as replacement housing. So you can easily look around and call things like that informality. And that's why I've always emphasized that we can't just look at urban morphologies. We can't just look at materials. We have to understand the land, the process, the policies, and the people behind them, because things can otherwise be masked. That are actually really different and have big implications for how people are able to live their lives and the security they have. So this was this idea about toehold urbanization, people exercising their own agency to build and finance their dwellings because opportunities are close by. So that's a way with which people try to overcome their peripheralization. On possibly the opposite side of that spectrum, I kept driving and trying to understand everything I could see from the air when I would do all of these travels between Switzerland and South Africa for my work over this kind of decade and a half I've been engaging in South Africa. And I realized that even the maps that I was showing, this little icon here on the right, that was too small, because the legacy of apartheid spatial planning that was going into the former Bantustans was going even far beyond my map. So my map and my site of exploration kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's never really stopped. So I started investigating a village called Seabe, which was technically not part of a Bantustan in the former Transvaal, but it was very close to a couple of different ones coming together there, where people, for example, one of my participants had been granted land. So her grandmother had been granted land. And that was her most valuable asset. So this is a woman who commutes about 4 hours to get to Pretoria from this village location. works for half a day and then goes home because she has to take the buses. Most of the time she can't afford to take taxis that would maybe get her there faster by driving through a game reserve. So the taxis are very clever. If you go under 30 minutes of time within this game reserve, they don't charge you money for it. So the taxis will zoom through. And she was telling me all these stories about how sometimes, this lovely summer sun, the lions would be out sunning on the pavement and they'd kind of have to dodge around when the taxis were coming. But this is a trade-off that people make. So she's commuting sometimes up to 8 hours a day to have a half day of employment, but she can afford to have a house there. She has one child who lives with her in this house. Her husband lives near OR Tampa International Airport because he's a gas station attendant at the airport. Their other daughter lives with him, and they have another child who lives in Rustenburg. So their family, and this is this classic kind of legacy of splintered families that resulted from apartheid, they're spread over this entire city region. And as I found out as work went on, that stretches much, much further as well when we start talking about the idea of home and sort of apartheid legacy. And she had all these big dreams for the house that she wanted to build because she had space and saving of resources to do so, and a dream that someday the whole family would come back together to live in this kind of space. And so I'm also really interested in the idea about transference of architectural plans and ideas. You can see these have actually really complicated roof lines. So that's something that's come to fascinate me quite a lot. Where do these ideas about what a home ideal is, where are they originating? So I'm trying to trace that a little bit currently. But these kind of stories of having stretched families, it has a nice legacy of scholarship, of course, in South Africa that's talked about things like this since the apartheid era, and a lot of wonderful activist work as well, talking about these stories of how people are basically relegated and have to commute, but it's always trade-offs people make. So the point for me was that just because it's far away, if it didn't make sense for people to do, they wouldn't be doing it. There's a reason why they're there, and it's a reason why they're doing this thing. And it's because of the space a lot of times. So there's an economic proposition and a trade-off people are making. So there's opportunities in centralities. There's also opportunities in geographic peripheries. Then there's also ways that people are taken advantage of there too. If we think, for example, about what I call aspirational urbanization, which is essentially the bond housing markets if you go to really distant geographic peripheries. So people want to invest in a home, as it's a very tried and true strategy here in some ways of trying to lift people out of poverty. A lot of great intentions in the post 1994 era. RDP program, all of those things that I'm sure you all know about. But being able to buy a house from a developer, that's a lovely aspiration in a way. It's architecturally, of course, there's much to criticize about the way it's being done, but you can't criticize someone for having the dream of having a home, right? And those are things that we have to work with as designers as well. We need to be able to shift the dialogue on things like that. So someday this isn't the dream, but we can provide other alternatives that are more sustainable. That's another argument to be made another time. But the thing about this that I find particularly predatory that was uncovered by the work, for example, of Sean Butcher and Richard Ballard, some colleagues of mine in Johannesburg, is that a lot of times these developer houses, if you have to pay 50% of the loan back in order to not have the house possibly immediately revoked. So if you miss even a single payment until 50% of the loan you've gotten is paid back for the house, the developer can repossess the house immediately. So there's lots of things that are happening where you think it's an opportunity to own a house, but it's also still recreating a different kind of precarity, because if you've invested your entire life savings and then your house is gone, then what do you have? And then people are often then finding their way back into the informal settlement. So there's still dynamics around that, this dialectic process between the increasing financialization of the housing market on the urban edge, where land is cheap, and people sort of boomerang movements around the city region. And this is where you really see this kind of boundless expansion of the urban fabric occurring. So a lot of my current work now is being conducted with sort of a larger group. They're called the Bushbuck Ridge Synthesis Working Group. It's a bunch of scholars based at the University of the Witwatersrand, at UCL, University of Glasgow, and some of us also in Central Europe, so me and Christian at the ETH Zurich. But we're looking basically at this kind of arc of what's happening in some of these former Bantustans of South Africa. So 7-8 hours drive outside of these, Johannesburg and Pretoria. And they're actually finding large concentrations of urbanization unfolding there because people are beginning to concentrate capital in these spaces that they say is home. So I think we've probably all heard people talk about going home to the rurals. That's something that means something for them. So as an urban scholar, I don't use the word rural because I think everything is sort of an interconnected process, but that word is really important to people and how they describe their lives. So again, if we're talking about the difference between material space and spatial practices, I would say that actually everything is interconnected. Entire territories are basically urbanized. If you have a smartphone and you're taking taxis and you're going to Johannesburg to earn money, then it's not a rural space because you're not practicing agriculture and being disconnected from those things. But if I talk to people, I would absolutely use that word because it means something to them. And I want to understand what it means to them because that's how they're making decisions. It's how they're spending their money. It's how they're making choices about their lives. So all these kind of new territorial configurations are starting to emerge in places like this, where again, you see the aspirational idea of a home and building this home. A nice dream for the post-apartheid era in a way. All these things are starting to unfold for sort of this emerging, I think maybe even we've discussed it as being kind of like a black middle class. But housing is not just an asset, but it's also, of course, a status symbol where you see, again, my fascination with these kind of roof lines and how these different material adaptations are unfolding. Because they're a social status signifier. It's for identity. There's all kinds of ways and reasons why people design the houses that they do. And I find it also fascinating to trace where the plans are coming from. So drafts people are becoming really important again in these kind of contexts. So I'm still trying to convince a doctoral student to do a project about tracing the origin of the plans and the roof lines and figure out where the people are living and how everything is being concentrated. So, I mean, we see again, the idea of the home is so important. And there's this crazy disconnect. This is some drone footage from my colleague, Graham Gutz from the GCRO. If you can see sort of the walls of the house, there's such a prevalence of this aesthetic imaginary of the roof lines of the home that the floor plans underneath in some ways are completely disconnected from how that's going. So that spatially as designers, we would look at this and say, oh my gosh, this sort of spatial syntax here, that makes no sense to me. But when you get these kind of things at the end with the roofs and this visual, so the elevation is so important, that imaginary. The columns are really important. All these kind of aesthetic articulations that make it feel like home. It's not just an expression of wealth, it's an identity marker, and it's really important for people. So we have to take it seriously. That's one of my main propositions. What people are doing, we need to treat that seriously and theorize from it. We have to keep in mind, of course, in these kind of contexts too, that there's really dire lacks of infrastructural systems. So if we think about like the taps that we're seeing here, it's because houses are being built. This is a much longer conversation, but being built on traditional authority land, where there's permission to occupy certificates being issued, and a lot of time the municipalities can't catch up with the speed of urbanization, so they're not able to service these houses. They're putting in water tanks. There's little taps that are going in. The electricity is lacking, and so if people can afford to, they're kind of going off the grid, and in some ways making even more inequality at these most remote spaces. The people that are in some ways still living a little bit off of farming or traditional healing practices, for example, then the land values are also going up, and then they're going to be pushed out of these places as they become urbanized. So we see the extent of this. I mean, and again, to say one more time, this is if I take a bus for 8 or 9 hours and I'm driving direct. So if people are doing this trip, it would probably take them multiple days to do. But this is how much kind of level of growth and urbanization we're seeing at these distant peripheries. And maybe to make a final point about why this also matters to me is because you see the commodification of land coming up in ways that are also really extractive. So one of these is for retail construction. There's a lot of great work that's ongoing by my colleague Sarah Charlton, for example, or Paula Meth and colleagues about their peripheries work in retail centers. But these things that are going up in kind of these former Bantustan areas several hundred kilometers away, I mean, there's targeting a market that I don't quite understand how it exists. So these are things that still really are fascinating me that we're just kind of putting our toes into now. And looking at how these kind of new extractive frontiers are developing because of mall and retail investments, which is usually financed by pension funds in South Africa in many cases, or sometimes even international corporations. But the discrepancy between, Daniel Hechter Paris and reselling onions from the boxer that people have bought wholesale at the store and sell outside the walls of the mall is something that really fascinates me, and how those kind of relationships shift and how informal traders are able to respond to this. Because these are kind of centralities in a way that are emerging. So again, I don't want to romanticize it too much, but this idea about popular urbanization being driven by people, I think is something that we can really see in places like this. So again, that takes us back to questions of land, it takes us back to questions of people and how they're doing, and how this idea of livelihoods is the foundation for all processes of urbanization. This is something that's happening outside the state. And this was something for me also when I was writing the book about the relationships between Lefebvrean theories and what I find in Joburg. Lefebvre does not have a language for this kind of thing, for centralities that are coming up outside of the state, because for him, he was living in Paris at the time of the student revolts in 1968 was very formative. But for him, centrality was always the state. It was in the city, and it was something that was produced by sort of official administrations. And you can see all over, for me at least, it's very clear, in somewhere like South Africa, we have centralities that are coming up that are made by people and in other ways. So this idea about popular centrality as people kind of encounter each other and exchange and generate and everyday life starts to thicken, those are the kind of things that I think we need to really understand well and be able to support. Of course, that being said, again, these are also very difficult and contested environments and fraught and challenging ones. So not to romanticize that people are building their own kind of township economies, but that really needs to be questioned as to which practices are there, because there's also violence and there's corruption and there's extraction that's happening in these spaces too. So again, complex, but I think a lot of really broad, important general lessons to be learned by urbanization that's being driven by people, again, with their choices and their own economic strategies to sustain urban life. And where I think this idea about peripheralization really unfolds is in these kind of spaces between. So there's, I mean, this is, again, looking at Johannesburg, and I'm sorry for being such a Joburg person today. I'll try to bring more Cape Town to the table at a future time. But I mean, when Henri Lefebvre talks about the complete urbanization of society and the complete urbanization of the planet, I mean, when you look at this picture, I feel you really see it. What on earth is going on in between the centers we know and the peripheries we know? I mean, capturing all of this stuff is it's really a lifetime project. And so I called it in the book, it's a term that needs sharpening. So I'm happy for further engagement with any of you that want to help me with this problem. But I think peripheralization is actually happening here in this kind of mesh in between. So there are opportunities for people. If you look at the picture, there's always some wealthier housing you can see in the lower right corner there, tell by the greening in the trees, usually from the air quite easily. But I think that the land here and the spaces between centralities that came from this history of mining and colonialism and industrialization, that's something that's flexed by the state and by private capital to continue to maximize value extraction. And so that's why I kind of think of this as like a mode of territorial production that's also characteristic of many post-colonial contexts and that have been global sites of extraction and exploitation over many years. So again, center and periphery can make lots of different kinds of opportunity, but if there's these spaces between when you're trapped in transit for most of your day every day, I mean, I don't know really if that's kind of the aspirational life that people want to have. I mean, oftentimes interviews have kind of indicated, no, not really. It's really stressful when they talk about ways of moving around the city and what it requires to do transit. So to kind of slowly wrap up the talk, again, in urban studies, peripheralization is not really yet well captured as a concept. I can alert you to a special issue that I'm co-editing with Christian Schmid and Metaxia Markaki, where we're going to try to do that. It's coming out in Antipode at this rate, probably not until next year. But we're trying really to get a little bit more of an actual definition of the term peripheralization. So there's just a little bit for you. Some things that are important to me is to think about urbanization, not just through, again, macro scale politics, economics, blah, blah, blahs and plans and not lived experience too, but that we have to also think through lenses like gender, we have to look at mobility, and we have to look at the ways that peripheralization is enacted, because it's usually deliberately enacted across multiple scales. So when I say, you know, some of my own theoretical work is really in developing this concept of popular centralities. And while they may emerge, again, we can't romanticize it because it's still precarious and it does become a site of extraction. So I almost think of this sort of malls coming in like a barnacle, attaching itself to these township economies and sucking things out of it. So again, it's never just either or. There's always a both and that gives new opportunities, like the example with the onions and the reselling of them. But all of those ways, when you see big capital coming into spaces, suddenly people have credit accounts at the mall that they need then to pay off. There are different ideas about what kind of jobs you can do, what kind of products you can buy. And that is part of a larger move that a lot of other colleagues, for example, in Latin America, have been commenting for many years, that basically the poor are being operationalized to be turned into consumers. It's a big problem in Chile, for example, the work of Nadine Rice and Michael Lucas. And that's something that you can see with really dramatic consequences, for example, also in China, where they're saying, you know, with the advent of data centers and AI, that you're basically seeing like post-human landscape. So what's central for capital may not be central for humans. Capital doesn't always need people. We need each other. And that's what I'd like to bring into this idea about peripheralisation. So again, all of this for me, it really does come from my understandings of South Africa and the way that things work here. So it's important to me also for my students here from Munich that we're learning from here and our theories come from here. And if we apply it to Munich, then we're finally reversing the trend because we're not coming from the north or from the west to say that we know things and we understand things. These are homegrown things that I find from here. So for me, the definition of peripheralisation is a spatial process through which land, labor, and life are organized to extract a social and ecological surplus. And the result of that, of these normative operations of urbanization, it's a peripheralization process when specific people or populations are being structurally disadvantaged by how that's unfolding. So if they're being put far away from decision-making power, it might be geographically, it could also be centrally. But that's why we have to really understand the space and how all of these different things emerge. Because the processes through which people are being peripheralized, they are still strikingly similar to the days of colonialism and imperialism, and they're just being articulated with kind of new geopolitical players and in new ways. So, you know, I think all of this is really an argument for a way of doing urban research from the ground up, but not remaining at the ground. By moving from everyday life to theory and back again and constantly crossing these different levels. And that's why I think the ideas about peripheralization as a process and understanding its origins, they maybe, like I said, come from Johannesburg and from its people, but we can see the rest of the world through these lenses as well. And that's what we try to do with our work in Munich as well, with our group, that we're trying to look at these different spatial expressions. We love to work collaboratively. We teach all kinds of courses that I'd be really happy to talk to you about if you're interested. And yeah, I would encourage you again to engage with us in any way. We're always actively looking for collaborations and cooperations. I believe very firmly that we work best in teams and we work best by sharing knowledge and in comparison. So I would be thrilled to see what you think is extraordinary and ordinary about the places you live too. Thank you.
It's so great to see this like massive reflection of yeah, 15 years. I mean, I know I've got lots of questions which I won't take away from the audience today, but maybe if there's any initial kind of, it's a question, it could be something that stood out for you, something that resonated. I'm sure there are questions. If you guys want to take a moment to think about that, and you can feel that we have some time.
Taking pictures of all the hands raised. I saw you first.
One.
Yeah, thank you. Beautiful presentation. It's so refreshing to hear about Joburg when I feel sometimes personally exhausted by unpacking Cape Town on a daily basis. So this is nice. My question is on your mapping on privileged urbanization. What I thought was of like spaces like Woodfall City,
yeah,
where it's almost as if, you know, they're choosing to stay within the metro area of Joburg, but essentially creating their own microcosm of the city, independent of the larger, maybe infrastructural problems. So it's kind of opting in and opting out.
Yeah.
Is that what you meant by that? I'm not sure if it's connecting.
Yes.
You're just
that is. So when I said these privileged urbanization processes, that has subcategories as well. So what you're describing, they're called elite island urbanization. So it's trying to be able to have access to the resources of the city without having any of the difficulties. So it really is, I don't know, maybe Lindsay, you maybe call it bypassing in a way from work from Legos, but yeah, it's exactly what you're describing. So there are a lot more categories that I didn't go into in detail with that, but also the commodification, I was calling it at the time, terms need revisiting again, but peripheral commodification, which is basically if you go to North Riding and you look at all of the townhomes that are coming up there for kind of the young professional class, which again is like the land is cheaper and the houses are a bit smaller. But I was really shocked at the time to learn that those kind of housing prices to buy, kind of a row house in North Riding was not so dissimilar to buying a large bond house in Soweto. And they were being sometimes even built by the same developers and marketed by completely different teams to completely different target audiences. But that was something where I felt that's actually making inequality more intractable in a way, because you're trying to keep populations with particular ideals and aspirations in the places that are already centers of privilege and have good road access and good supermarkets and it's very basic kind of things. Yeah, so there's a lot more to unpack with the math. I kind of just went over that quickly now. Yeah.
Question back there.
Mhm.
Mentioned another thing
Mhm.
about tracking day-to-day life on a smartphone. What-
Yeah.
what was that?
No, I wish I put some pictures of that in. No, the smartphone method was basically, it was kind of like a scaling up with like a snowballing kind of sample kind of thing. So I would go into spaces where I had identified them through a lot of previous research, through mapping and expert interviews, as to really what I was looking for was like, where are the tensions and where do the spaces of difference rub up on each other? So then I would kind of try to identify where's that and find access into those kind of communities. So I would have somebody connect me with a community leader there, or go through Plan Actor SDI usually to get to know someone locally. And then I would have like a focus group and try to meet people and always select kind of a representative population. So if I knew from broader quantitative data, the population there is 50-50 male, female, and this configuration of race and age, I would try kind of to look for that, but it's qualitative research. So it was like, kind of what was interesting to me and who I could get to know. And then after I kind of had met people and there was a bit of trust established between us, then I would ask them to use the smartphone app. So at the beginning, I think I did the first trial run of it in 2014 with just 5 people to test it out. So I had people in Diepsloot and in Jeppiestown and a couple of other places around Joburg and Tembisa. Some of them, one from Denver actually has done 4 or 5 different studies with me over the years. So that longitudinal data was really interesting to see how his life changed. But yeah, I would identify the person and then give them a smartphone. So I used to provide the smartphone and the data, and then tell them, okay, look, carry this around for X number of days. So for my dissertation, I did it with 30 people for 30 days. And because, again, it was all really about trust and the data was used in a qualitative way, not in a quantitative way in that particular project. And so what I would do then with the following up on that was that I would make sure that for every person that I had in the study, I would spend at least 1 entire day with them and just say, just go about your lives and let me come with you today. So I could also understand really intimately what did all of these different data points mean. And so the app itself works just basically like any other kind of running app that you're familiar with, like Strava or Runtastic or these kind of things. It used to be able to do more with that kind of stuff. Now it's quite complicated. But all of your phones, they have this thing called mobile sensing in them. So if you're moving around and you've got this in your hand, your phone knows the frequency with which you're moving. So it can't tell me the difference between being on a bus and being in a car, but it does know if I'm walking. It knows if the screen is on. And so all the app did was basically take that data and then display it. So it had like a thing for the user so that they could see their maps, which was also really fascinating to talk to people about. They'd never really seen their patterns before in a lot of cases. And then I would get like an Excel database on the back end of all these different GPS points. So it would report, it would predict the mode of transportation from the sensing thing, and it would show the pathways. So then I could see exactly like at 12:12, Tandy departed here and she arrived here at 12:37, then she had to wait for an hour. And then when I would do the follow-ups with them, I could really see that path. So it was just a really intense way of understanding the cost of making life work. And of these infrastructural solutions. So, I mean, a lot to say about paratransit, but it does get people where they need to go. So that's another issue. But yeah, is that I'm happy to show you some examples of that after if you want. I can show you all the different mapping things. But yeah, so it's an intense process. Working with tech is not easy.
I think those couple, take those last 2 because it's
Okay, thank you very much.
very rich, dense presentation. And in a sense, it's a main work of hundreds of ideas. So I'm quite interested in what your PhD, what is the thesis? Is there a thesis about urbanization and the exchange of contemporary ways of praxis to do peripheralisation? And then what is the order of it? The way you describe it, it seems to be a byproduct maybe of centralization and capitalism. In the sense, the periphery is the wasteland, it's the, the extended. And you seem to be discerning little centers happening at the periphery.
Yeah.
So is this a practice? And is it something that's appropriate for our condition on this continent? And one of the biggest things is the projections of population growth. Like Cape Town was meant to reach 5 billion in 2030, and reached it last year. So 5 years in advance. So how do you cope with those things? And then within that is what is the institutional basis for this? So the ordinary city also centralized those things, but like you're looking at mobility of individuals, but I'm quite interested in the friction and why people may be coming together to form strategies. I don't know if you know, when Kolas is writing on Lagos and Harvard, he looks at Lagos and goes through the project there, and he leaves because he says that Lagos is a city that has its own logic. It's not modern, and he says it's ahead of modernism, in the words of Western tradition. And basically wants to be building, so he goes to China. But he doesn't say what's the order of Lagos. So one thing I would be looking for is maybe a comparative thing between peripheralization in different contexts, especially on the continent, and also between Cape Town and Joburg. Our periphery on East here is agriculture.
Yeah.
And in a sense, it's not peripheralization, it's a peripheralization of the rural areas coming into the urban. So these are complex things. And so what is your thesis on peripheralization? We just want to educate myself as a practitioner.
That's a complex question. I'll try to unpack it properly. I'll start maybe at the end. So part of this larger project that I mentioned of this Bushbuck Ridge Working Synthesis Group. So one of our colleagues is Les Banks, who works from the Eastern Cape and has done a lot of work in trying to understand from an anthropological lens, what does it mean, this idea of home, and what are the relationships that people have between the city and the former Bantustans of the Eastern Cape? Because that's something, as you were saying, it's different in Cape Town. It's very different there, the motivations that people have going between home and the city than they are to Gauteng, which is oftentimes, I mean, they're also talking about ancestral practices and home, but it's a lot of economic decisions. And Les is saying, no, it's not that in the Eastern Cape, it's something different. So comparison even among South African regions is really, really valuable. We have colleagues in Durban as well who are doing the work there, which all has a much stronger environmental and ecological angle than some of the work does in other parts, even of South Africa. So I think that the comparison is absolutely crucial to understand why things are within South Africa as well as other places on the continent. And as far as, so that's one piece of the institutional arrangement. It's I've been based in Switzerland for a long time. I'm not South African, obviously. I'm American originally and naturalized Swiss, but I wouldn't do any of the work I do without it being always articulated through local partners and working very carefully in developing ideas. So CUSP, for example, we have a partnership with the GCRO, not as data providers, but as partners in conceiving what questions do we even need to be asking, because that was some of the quality of life surveying that they do, and identifying all these different population growth trends and saying, okay, well, why is there 3% urbanization and population growth occurring in Bushbuck Ridge? Fascinating. Okay, so that starts from a question that someone's asked because people are already making that move. So they're ahead of us. So maybe to link to what you said about Rem Koolhaas, I think in a lot of ways, cities of the global south, places like Johannesburg, this much bigger configuration, right? So when I say Joburg, I don't just mean the city center, I mean all of it. There are absolutely practices that are in some ways to me leapfrogging over things that we have in Europe, because in Europe, we still have this idea about the centralized state solving all of our problems. And if we pay our taxes, it'll get done. It's not going to work forever. I mean, our infrastructure is also starting to fail and it's too expensive to replace. And, train rides are taking hours longer. A colleague was telling me just a few months ago that he was in Portugal and the overhead electric lines got so hot that the train stopped running for an entire day. So do we have the resources to replace this? Do we have the inventiveness to come up with an alternative system like paratransit? And we're faced with it, we're going to need ideas from somewhere. So I think that this sort of like going back and forth always between different contexts and the work of comparison and the work of collaboration is the best thing I can say to that. As far as actual practice decisions, I think understanding people's everyday lives gives us different design ideas. I think understanding why people are building houses the way they are, with just the example of the roof lines, there's a really specific reason why those things are happening. And if we understand it and we want to shift, for example, to something that's more social justice, environmental justice, purely sustainable building materials related, that's convincing work that we have to do, that people should change their aesthetic imaginary. So we have to understand it before we can ask them to change.
I think
Yeah.
last question could be the masses living outside.
Okay.
That's fine.
Beginning, you mentioned that urban policy sort of looks at either bringing people towards centers or making more centers where people are, and because there's a third way, which is this research that you're doing. And you've also, your process looks so much like a very dynamic and constantly shifting thing of lived experience and pattern formation, and then the time it takes to recognize that pattern and then theorize that pattern. And then I would imagine make policy out of that pattern, which is very static.
Yeah.
You even mentioned when you looked at your map that 10 years ago, the categories are different to what it is now. So I'm interested in how you navigate that time lag in the work that you do and the effect that you're trying to have in, like, how do you see, because I think, yeah, I can really relate to that.
That's a key frustration. I mean, research moves really slowly. I think about how long it took even just to write a paper or write a book or make policy reports. So that's also part of the bigger project that I'm involved in, is we make policy reports. So we're putting them to Bushbuck Ridge Local Municipality, Province of Mpumalanga. There's all kinds of different levels of governance where these reports get filed, also a national level one. I mean, it takes ages, but we've been doing the research over the last 2 years, something like that. And we're submitting the policy reports now for all these provinces across South Africa. So the recommendations, and in some senses, it is frustrating because by the time you've made it and put it out there, it may not be as relevant anymore, or things might be shifting again. I mean, I think that these ideas about the former Bantustans as a place where economic and population growth is happening is actually not that surprising to me in a sense, because it's so tied to land values. So if we think on the bigger scale, maybe that's a good way to wrap up, but if we can really think locally but connected to the larger scale, we're going to see those things a lot faster and be able to react better. So there is a lag time, but that's also why practice is so important, because we can respond so much faster by just doing projects and moving. And that's why I think, especially in South Africa, the private sector is so important to engage with as well. You cannot just rely on the state. The processes take too long, and there's too many things that shift. So we have to find alternative models of financing and acting as well.
Oh, it's pleasant. Thank you, Lindsay, so much. Thank you all for hanging out. So students, my students, we're going to have to go to the lobby. So we can just meet there and figure out our next step. Thank you.